These are technique tips for Germany question 5. This is the question on the paper which carries the most marks, and so it's absolutely worthwhile taking time to make sure you know how to compete for the very top marks. You'll notice in this example, the topic in question is opposition and resistance. Please note again carefully the date restrictions in place. Any information that is given outside of this time frame cannot be rewarded. You're asked if you agree with the statement that opposition and resistance totally failed. In this case, you have to show that you've considered both sides of the argument before you have finally decided if you agree or disagree. And so really we are having a discussion, an argument on the page before you decide in your conclusion. You must start by undertaking some thinking or planning. It should usually take the form of a table or two sides or two lists, something basic that gets your ideas flowing. This is quite detailed, but just to give you support as you would consider the answer to this question. You can see on one side of the table I have lots of reasons why we might consider that opposition and resistance failed. On the other side, you can see that I'm countering the argument. Opposition and resistance didn't totally fail. Your plan might be as simple as having youth, church, army on one side, and you may have on the other church, youth, individuals on the other. This, as I say, is more detailed a plan than you will perhaps have time for in your exam answer. So how does that translate into a written answer? You will come up with two sides to your argument. The first side, in this case, agrees, and so takes the argument from the first side of the table. You're agreeing that actually opposition and resistance failed. And you can see I have given the points. Hitler was never removed from power. Youth opposition failed, church opposition failed, and army. But how have I developed those points? You can see here that each point is explained. That, for example, Hitler was never removed, and so therefore any opposition failed. The young people, most people weren't in opposition. 7 million conformed. Most people attended Hitler Youth. Many even spoke fondly of their youth under Hitler. Churches, you're explaining why they failed. There were only a minority who tried to stand against it. You will notice the leaders of these opposing churches were arrested and eventually executed. In the army, their attempts to oppose Hitler ended up with 5,000 being executed, and so therefore we judge it to be a failure. It's these explanations that take us into the higher mark bands. But if we only considered how they failed, we will only ever get 8 marks. And so we must raise the counter argument. In this case, we'd be taking it from the plan on the other side, that opposition and resistance didn't totally fail. Indeed, here you can see examples in youth, church, Jews, individuals, who all made attempts at opposition or resistance that did not fail. But it's not enough to mention them. We must explain why we have said their actions were not a failure. So, for example, in the church, many people were attracted to these opposing groups, like the confessional church. Bishop von Galen, a Roman Catholic bishop in Munster, managed to change the Nazi program of euthanasia. The Jews stood up against Hitler, and they managed to kill 300 Nazi officers and indeed destroy a crematorium, which limited the Nazi plans for destruction. And we're showing how each time their opposition and resistance brought some success. We also look at individuals like Oskar Schindler, who saved 1,100 Jews. That's successful. And also we can look at, for example, whenever we have teachers or individuals who limit the suffering in this time, surely their resistance brought success to those whose suffering they limited. And then we have a conclusion. Overall, what is your view? My view was that yes, opposition and resistance when set against the Nazi regime seems small. But for each of those people who benefited from opposition and resistance, it was a huge moment. And so we can't say that it totally failed, because for some individuals it brought hope and indeed perhaps deliverance from Nazism. You must be sure you present both sides with lots of evidence and explain why that evidence makes you judge, in this case, failure or success. So where does it go wrong? Sometimes, and maybe most commonly, we fall into the trap of only covering one side of the argument. We decide that it did totally fail and that's the end of the story. Should you fall into that trap, you lose 8 marks. That's a fifth of all the marks available in Nazi Germany, and that's going to limit the grade that you can get. Sometimes people misunderstand the counter-argument. In this, some people suggest that actually the Nazis faced no opposition and resistance and that they were only ever totally successful, and that they go ahead and say all the ways the Nazis were successful. That's a misinterpretation of the question and cost people dear. The detailed examples are not given. You mention the youth, but you don't give ideas of what the youth groups were. You mention the churches, but you don't name the important leaders. Those are important if you want the higher marks. And as I say, sometimes just the evidence or the examples are not fully developed. Let's try and avoid these mistakes and get the best marks in the 16 marker.